First, Professor Gary Barkhuizen is from Applied Linguistics, University of Auckland in New Zealand. His teaching and research interests are teacher education and language teacher, learner identity, study abroad, and narrative inquiry. And I'm sure that I don't have to explain too much because I think everybody here has already known so much about him. It's a very great honor for us to have Professor Gary Barkhuizen as a keynote speaker today. Today, he's going to talk about immigrant identity integration over time, a cognitive development narrative study. Please welcome Professor Gary Barkhuizen.
Thank you very much. Am I on? Good.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here on a Saturday morning. I think this is probably one of the best organized conferences I've been to certainly for a very long time. So thank you for the wonderful organization, and thank you also for the invitation. I'm really pleased to be here with you for the next half hour or so, and then I'll be staying with you for the conference as well. I'm going to get straight into sharing my screen. I've only got 30 minutes, and I've got quite a bit to get through. But if I get onto sharing my screen, I can show you what I'm planning to do. If I could just get a little indication that you can see that. Is that all right? Can you see that? Okay, good. Just go back one. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about that study with the title you can see on top there. But just before I do that, I'll talk just a little bit about me to set the context for that study. And also to let you know about some of the early projects that I've worked on some time ago, which gives you background to the study that I'm going to share with you today. And when I get onto the study, obviously I can't go into too much detail with the time I've got, so I'm just going to be really selective and point out one or two aspects of the study that I think are quite interesting from both a theoretical and also a methodological perspective. So just to get straight on to that, I'm originally from South Africa, and I went to a university called Rhodes University in Grahamstown, and I studied in the linguistics department there, Department of English Language and Linguistics, and you can see a nice multilingual sign there. This is in a language called isiXhosa that I'll talk about a little bit later. But after I graduated there, I taught for a couple of years in the same department, and then went to study abroad, which is another area of my research interest. I went to the UK, and then I went to Columbia University to do my doctorate, where I eventually graduated with a little more hair than I've got now. And after completing my doctorate, I returned to South Africa, where I taught at high school, a fabulous school called Mabatu High School in the northwest region of the country, where I taught English as a second language, and gained fantastic experience at the school. I was there for a number of years, and then decided I wanted to go to university to get involved in teacher education. And I went back to my same university, where I got a job and spent the next 10 years working in language teacher education. At that time, this was the sort of mid to late 1990s, things were changing a lot in South Africa. Apartheid had come to an end. Many of the institutions, including educational institutions, were becoming racially integrated and therefore multilingual as well. So I was interested in doing some research in some of these multilingual institutions in this region, in the town Grahamstown in the Eastern Cape. Now, the Eastern Cape region has this language here, isiXhosa, as the majority language in that region. But in the institutions, and particularly the state institutions English was typically the official institutional language of communication in the policy documents. For example, at least in the policy documents, in real life, things were a little bit different. Afrikaans, which was one of the two official languages, English and Afrikaans, during the apartheid era, was historically a dominant institutional language as well. And isiXhosa, which was the majority language of the region, and institutional populations were mainly isiXhosa speakers, was one of the other dominant languages that you would find in institutions. There are 8 other official languages in South Africa, making 11 official languages altogether. And there would be some of those 8 official languages spoken in this region, the Eastern Cape region, but mainly you'd find English, Afrikaans, and isiXhosa. And with the change that was taking place in the institutions, I thought it would be interesting to see exactly what was going on. And so one of my colleagues at Rhodes University, Vivian de Klerk, and we decided to have a look at the army base, the big army base that was situated in the town. And we were interested to see what is going on in terms of language contact and language use and so on. So I'll just give you a little bit of objective survey data here. I won't get into the more, we did a number of interviews and other types of data collection as well. But I just want to make a point about the institutional languages and how they were used. So in terms of the number of participants we had in the survey study, isiXhosa, which is the dominant language of the region, that was the major language that was spoken in this army base. Now, Afrikaans, which again was the former official language, came second, and then Siswati, Tshivenda, and the other languages, and English way down here on only 1.5%. So isiXhosa expected to have a high percentage because of where the army camp is situated. And in fact, all 11 languages were spoken in this army camp, which was quite interesting because this was just after apartheid was dismantled, and the army was an interesting institution because the different armies and different struggle groups, for example, were all came together into one defense force for the new country. So people from various different language groups all came together. We decided also to do a study in the local prison to see what is going on there in terms of language contacts and language use. This was a little more difficult to get into and a little more difficult to get data. For example, we couldn't really survey all the prisoners, but we were able to get some ethnicity data. And you can see, looking at the data here, that the majority by far were either black at 52% or what is classified as colored or mixed race in South Africa at the time, with just a very few whites in this particular jail, in this prison. Linguistically, we could only survey the staff who worked there, and you could see that isiXhosa, which is the language of that region, was very high at 50%. Afrikaans, the institutional language, the previously sort of dominant institutional language, very high, but English in both cases quite low. Even though in terms of the policy documents coming from the regional state and also South Africa, the Constitution, and many policy documents, English was the dominant language. And this was reflected in one of the comments from an army trainee. And he says that there must be a top language. That should be English. This is the only language that is the communication language for instruction. English is good because it is whereby we can understand each other. So very much reflecting what the policy documents say about the language of communication in a state institution. But in reality, things are far more complex, right? So here we've got another trainee, also isiXhosa, so he would be black ethnicity, saying if they, talking about the officers, meet this guy and he's pointing to a colored Afrikaans speaker, if they automatically they would speak Afrikaans to him. And this is where the ethnicity and language are interrelated, because they would see from the way he looks, his ethnicity would be colored and therefore assume he speaks Afrikaans, because they know that he speaks Afrikaans. But when they speak to me, looking black, some of us, they speak English, because the officers would not be able to speak his language, which is isiXhosa. So it's far more complex in reality. It doesn't really reflect what goes on in terms of the institution. So a number of studies emerged from a number of publications emerged from those two studies. This group over here, you can see we focused on language policy in that army base. We looked at the role of English, how English was used. We looked at language attitudes, the role of isiXhosa. And we also looked at ethno-linguistic identity in situations of language contact in the army base. In the prison, we looked at language usage again and attitudes, as well as the role of Xhosa and English in the prison service. So a number of publications came out that looked at this very interesting, newly multilingual, multicultural institutions in this particular geographical region. And then in 2001, I moved from South Africa to New Zealand and started work at the University of Auckland. And when I got to Auckland, I decided that I would continue my interest in the South African population but now were living in New Zealand. And so I started this particular study where I was looking at Afrikaans-English bilingual South Africans living in New Zealand. And I wanted to have a look at their identity and language-related experiences of being immigrants now living in New Zealand. And there were 28 participants in the study, all the way from down south in Invercargill right up to Whangarei in the north, of a wide range of ages, people who'd been here from only 4 months to 14 years, and different genders. Now, Afrikaans in South Africa, for those of you who don't know Afrikaans, it's a language very widely spoken across the whole nation, particularly in this western part of South Africa, very sparsely populated. The deeper the blue color, the more Afrikaans is spoken, but there are very few people living in this area, except for Cape Town down here. But altogether, there's about, this is old census data, it's not any new data, but about 13.5, I think it's gone down to about 12% of the population who speak Afrikaans as a home language. Not that many out of the 55, 56 million people in South Africa. In New Zealand, the South African and Afrikaans speakers have increased steadily over the years from 91 to 2013. You can see the numbers almost sort of doubling every census period. This is 2013 data, and I imagine it's gone up since then. But of the South African immigrants in New Zealand, about half are Afrikaans speakers or identify as speakers of Afrikaans in the census data. So there's a substantial Afrikaans speaking population. And of course, they would also be speakers of English as well. So you can see here in 2013, about 27,000, and there'd be more than that who identify as Afrikaans speakers as their home language. And so just getting back to that study, what I did was I collected from those 28 participants across New Zealand life history interviews where I traveled around the country and spent time with them and interviewed them about their language practices, both in South Africa and in New Zealand, and their awareness of language policies in both countries, maintaining Afrikaans and learning and using English. Also, their language attitudes and their identity negotiations and shifts, asking them to talk about how they identify, but also obviously interpreting the data to find out more about their own identity constructions. And there were a number of publications that came out of this study. This first one here looked at what I call linguistic longing. So missing Afrikaans, not being able to speak it as readily and easily as they could in South Africa, for example. So an interesting concept, which we called linguistic longing. Also, this one is looking at children's language practices from the perspective of their parents. And then we looked at macro level policy and how families implemented that within their own micro level situations. One of the questions I asked the participants when I interviewed them was to think back to the time they were still in South Africa, pre-departure, and to think about how they anticipated their move to New Zealand in terms of language and identity. So I said, you know, think back to when you were still in South Africa and you were just about to move. What were you thinking about language use, and how did you think you were going to change from a sociolinguistic perspective? And it was very hard for them to answer that question, particularly retrospectively to answer that question. So what I did then was I managed to get funding to go to South Africa and interview pre-immigrants. So I identified, I think there were 15 participants who I found in South Africa who had decided that they were going to immigrate to New Zealand. And this was across the country in different parts of South Africa. I traveled around, I found these people and interviewed them and said, look, you're moving to New Zealand. And then I interviewed them about their anticipation of their expectations of moving to New Zealand. And so I was able to get the data before they left. So there were a few publications, but I've just mentioned two here. This is where we asked them to reflect, or we're reporting on their reflections of their pre-departure expectations, anticipations of language use, identity change, and so on. And then here, we called it imagined identities, where they expressed their ideas about how they thought they were going to change. Really, really interesting. Then one of the participants in this study, in the pre-departure, was Mia. I'll call her Mia. As I said, she was a participant in the 2003 pre-departure study, and I interviewed her in June 2003 in Pretoria in South Africa. She's a fluent Afrikaans-English bilingual. She studied both languages at university level, and as she said, language is her profession. She works as a technical editor. She works in the language field. She was the main applicant for her family to get residents to come to New Zealand. Her ethnicity is white. And she, at the time of immigration, was in her early 40s. She was married, and she had 3 children who their ages 12, 10, and 3 on arrival in New Zealand. Within a week, she secured a job, and she's been steadily employed ever since. As I said, she was a technical writer. She arrived in New Zealand in 2004, so a few months after I interviewed her in South Africa. And when she arrived, she contacted me, I think, and we went and had coffee, and we caught up. And then I never saw her again until 15 years later. I got an email from her. She said she's coming onto campus for something. How about we have lunch? I said, okay, that would be great. And while we were having lunch, I was sitting there, wouldn't it be interesting to interview her to see how the last 15 years have gone, following up my previous study from 2003. So we set up an interview. I went to her house and spent the afternoon and discovered that it was almost 15 years to the day that I interviewed her in South Africa. It was in June 2018, 15 years later. So what I'm going to talk about for the rest of my time, just briefly, is a little bit about how things went for her over that 15-year period. This study has just been published in World Englishes. You can find it at that link over there. So I'm just going to be very selective, just to show you 1 or 2 interesting theoretical and methodological things I did with the study. I can't show you the whole thing. So the study aimed to explore the complexity of social inclusion, as well as its complex intersections with language and identity in the immigrant life experiences of Mia. So looking at social inclusion and how that interrelates with language and identity. Social inclusion refers to the extent to which immigrants are included or excluded socially, economically, emotionally, and politically through their language practices and the language ideologies that prevail in the context in which they practice their language or use their language. And Linda Yates adds that a sense of affiliation, a sense of inclusion or well-being and being welcomed relates to social inclusion. Also, she emphasizes the reception of newcomers by members of the host community. So it's not just one way, but how the immigrants, in this case, Mia, for example, would feel welcomed by the host community and how she would feel an affiliation with that host community. So these were some of the theoretical ideas that guided my thinking when I was looking at Mia's experiences of social inclusion. What I did was I came across a study that looked at how identity integration, a sort of cognitive development model of identity integration, how we change, how we develop when we go through a particular transition in our lives. It could be immigration, it could be an organizational merger. They come from psychology, so it's not only language education or immigration, but some big change in our lives over time, and how we change, how our identities, social identities, become integrated in terms of cognitive development. And they have a 4-stage model. So this explains the specific processes by which multiple social identities develop intra-individually, so within the individual, and become integrated within the self over time. So there's 4 stages. These are very much interlinked, they're overlapping, and you can move back and forth across these stages, but it's a developmental model. It's cognitive development because it's an intra-individual developmental perspective on identity. And what they're suggesting here is that these social identities become integrated within the self. And I thought that these 4 stages of the model would offer a useful framework for thematically categorizing Mia's narrated identities. So in other words, I looked at these 4 stages and I thought these would be useful themes that I could search for deductively, in a way, in Mia's interview data, in the story she tells in her interview data. So I had this sort of theoretical model as a thematic framework that I was then going to use to analyze my data. Just a little bit more about Amiot and colleagues. During times of significant life changes, such as immigration, the need to integrate new and potentially conflicting social identities can trigger the proposed developmental process in a recursive fashion. So it's these significant life changes that trigger this developmental process. These significant life changes may mean that there will be identity changes and identity conflicts that we experience. And as that happens, eventually, as you work through these developmental stages, which I'll get onto next, so they become integrated within the self, intra-individually. The model also includes specific antecedents that can influence the extent to which immigrants move from one development stage to the next. And these could be both inhibitors or facilitators. So these inhibitors could be things like feelings of threat and status and power asymmetries. Facilitators could include coping and adaptation and social support. So these are some of the things which could either inhibit or facilitate the movement of through the developmental stages. Okay, so let me just quickly outline what these 4 stages are. They're quite interesting. So the first one is anticipatory categorization. This initiates the process of integrating new social identities into the self. And it starts as soon as one anticipates a change, even before the change itself. So even before immigration, you can anticipate engaging with a new social group, even before you actually encounter that social group. So you can start saying, oh, there may be differences, there may be similarities between that social group and myself, all right? So you are anticipating some sort of categorization, identity categorization. And then when you actually are confronted by change and by other social groups, this categorization takes place. So the move to a new country has taken place, and the person actually encounters the new social group. The differences between the individual and the new group are too highly differentiated at this stage for the immigrant to conceive of the new group's characteristics as being part of the self. So in this early stage where the first meeting with this other group, you see yourself as too different to be identify or affiliate with that particular group, or to identify with that group, to integrate that identity into the self. Compartmentalization takes place where you still see the separation of the different identities or the different social groups, but in certain social contexts, so it's context dependent. So membership with various groups is context dependent, and multiple social identities become compartmentalized and remain distinct and separate within the person's self. So you can identify with different social groups, but only in certain contexts, right? So they do remain separate within the self. They're not totally integrated, but they remain separate. In certain social contexts, you can identify with this group or that group. And then integration at this 4th stage, here the different identities constituting the self are simultaneously important to the self. And although similarities and differences between them are acknowledged, the self feels coherent rather than conflicted. It's not so context dependent here. It's more it's coherently integrated within the self. I must just say that the model has variations of variable levels of integration, which I'm not going into here. Okay, so what I did with the study was I looked at stories that Mia told me. For example, just to emphasize that stories are really useful because they make life experiences meaningful. In this quote, you can see they preserve our memories and prompt our reflections. They connect us with our past and present and assist us to envision our future. I really like this quote. So stories is a nice way to get our participants, or in this case, to get Mia, to tell me about her life experiences. So here's one of the stories which I extracted from the interview. This is from the pre-departure short story 1. I called it You Are Floating. This is in 2003 when she was still in South Africa. It's quite hard to read all of this, but you can lean into your screens and you can see it. I'm not going to go through the whole story, but just a couple of quotes. Here she says, I was asking her, to talk about how what she thinks about her life in New Zealand. And she says, what I was thinking in the beginning, because you are floating, you are almost floating in the beginning years. So you can see she uses this nice metaphor of how, as an immigrant, you haven't quite landed properly. You're floating in terms of how you're using language. You're floating in terms of your identity. All right, a nice sort of metaphor, very much anticipating what she's going to be experiencing. Later on, she says, and I think moving from one country to another and changing everything that you know without knowing exactly what's going to hit you is going to be a profound experience. and it will definitely affect my identity. You see, she's anticipating identity change already, and my idea of who I am and where I am standing in the world, and language is definitely a part of that. Isn't that nice? So she's saying, I'm anticipating that my identity is going to change, and that language is going to be important in terms of how that identity shift unfolds. So in this short story, you can see she's already anticipating some change. She's clearly at the anticipatory categorization stage of that developmental model. Through projecting herself and attributes into a novel social environment, the process of integrating new identities into the self has begun. Okay, here's another one. This is one of the stories from 15 years later, which I've called my social inclusion stories, because she actually addresses social inclusion directly. She says, yeah, I think you will always be a foreigner to some degrees. Now, remember, she's been living in New Zealand 15 years, and she's able to say, I've been here 15 years, but I will always be a South African. I'll always be a foreigner, even though I've lived here 15 years. So she's able to categorize, to compartmentalize these identities, right? But nevertheless, I would say that if we read the whole story, that she has integrated these identities coherently, intra-individually. Here's another one. So for me, my language has been the tool of engaging with others. She's very successful at work and within her community as well. So language, she's a very proficient English speaker. And she talks in line 12, which means a high standard of English. And because I feel that I'm respected in that, it's easy for me to feel included in the workplace. So she feels included, engaging with others. She feels included, that social inclusion. She doesn't have a problem with that. And then here, I've never felt that I wasn't a part of the New Zealand community if I chose to be there. So explicitly expressing a social inclusion, which means I chose. As long as you wanted to learn and be part of it, you never felt excluded if I put myself out there. So here, the story exemplifies the integration stage of identity development. She reflexively perceives her identities to be coherently integrated within the self and not in conflict. All right. So I've just given you a taste. I haven't done a full analysis of that story. So just a brief conclusion then, after living in New Zealand for 15 years, Mia has integrated her new identities into her coherent self. She's no longer floating, but nevertheless still perceives differences between what she calls her South Africanness and New Zealand cultural identity. So across the stories, a number of salient themes help to explain the processes of Mia's social inclusion and identities. I just want to finish off going through these rather quickly, these themes which came across the story. So the first, of course, was English language. Pillay and Takahashi claim that language mediates access to social inclusion, and that certainly was the case with Mia's stories, with Mia's experiences. High level of English proficiency enabled her to use English as a tool for social engagement. Employment is another theme across her stories. She says, I know who I am in terms of where I work. Work was vital to her perception and understanding of herself. She's also ambitious and very successful in her career. In all the stories, she foregrounds aspects of her work and highlighting her language skills, her professional standards, and so on. And again, Pillay and Takahashi argue that employment is at the heart of social inclusion, and this certainly seems to be the case with Mia. Host culture reception was another important theme. Living in the diverse city of Auckland, Mia finds that South Africans, as a rule, she says, find a good deal of acceptance. She's never experienced being excluded. And she says, as I've just in that last story, it's easy for me to feel included in the workplace. So she experiences reception from the host culture. Now, agency is interesting. I like this quote, a subjective sense of agency may also be reflected in increased involvement in society. And so Mia's sense of agency comes through in all her stories. She says in that second story, for example, I put myself out there. She's saying that, you know, she in using first person, I did this, I put myself. And even pre-departure, she says, you have to reestablish yourself. I will have to become. Okay, and then finally, this important theme of coping and adaptation. This was one of the antecedents in Amiot's model. In a pre-departure interview at the anticipatory categorization stage, she's already shows an inclination to adapt to her imagined sociocultural context. She says, I will have to become more of what the norm is over there. So she's already showing a willingness to adapt. And then when in New Zealand, she always endeavors to fit in, she says in her words. And as long as you want to learn and be part of New Zealand culture, you won't feel excluded. So she's showing this willingness and flexibility, right? Okay, I thought I'd end there, and we can take some questions. Firstly, I want to thank you, and I want to wish you good luck for all of you who are presenting this morning and this afternoon. I'm looking forward to the rest of it. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Gary. From now on, we're gonna have 10 minutes of Q&A session, and Tegu and Lisa, who are the committee members, will help to deliver some questions from the chat. So please raise questions if you have in the chat box.
There's one question here that I can read for Gary, and I can't see exactly who it's from because it's a shortened version of their name. But the question is, how does the 4-stage model vary in different immigrant groups? Mia moved to New Zealand out of free will, I assume, but what about refugees? How does the model apply there? So Gary, can I leave that to you?
Yeah, I think that model, if you read their article, it's a theoretical piece, right? It's not an empirical piece that they write. It's a theoretical piece, and I think they're just sort of proposing this theoretical model. And at the end of the article, they suggest methodological ways in which the model could be tested. So, and they come from very much from a quantitative perspective. And so they're looking at ideas for statistical measures of these different stages. So there'd be surveys, there'd be different ways of statistically measuring the developmental stages and the extent to which someone is in a particular cognitive developmental stage. So what I did was I just looked at the labels for the stages and thought they would be useful to serve as themes for my qualitative analysis of my interview data. So if you use it that way, the way I did, I think that it could be used for any population group, for any group, any type of immigrant group or refugee group in any context. And I think there would be differences. I think there certainly would be differences depending on, of course, who the group is. And I think there would be interesting differences to show how one moves through the stages, or if they do, and to what extent. What they do say, which is interesting, is that the development stages, any studies should be longitudinal. Because you move through the stages over time. It's not something you can do very quickly because, refugees and immigrants and other, going into a new job, any type of transition in your life, it needs to be measured in some way over time. So yeah, I think there would certainly be, there'd be differences. I'm not sure how the model could be applied differently in terms of research. This was just something I thought would be a different approach to doing an analysis, going in to the analysis with some ideas for what I was looking for, as opposed to always having a more sort of data-driven approach where inductively trying to figure out what the themes might be. So it was quite nice. I felt quite reassured for a change that, I'm going in with some tools, and I'm going to spend time looking particularly for those.
Okay, thank you for that, Gary. We have another question from Cheryl, who says, being a New Zealander has many modes. And is there a sense that Mia has a South African model of being a New Zealander?
Yeah, no, good. I certainly think so. I mean, she is identified as a South African, or being originally South African as soon as she opens her mouth, right? Because of her accent. So she sounds South African. She comes from an Afrikaans-speaking background, although she's very bilingual. She comes from an Afrikaans-speaking background, so she has quite a strong South African accent. By strong, I mean it's easily identifiable as South African, and so she's certainly, she identifies herself as a South African New Zealander, and others would also identify her as a South African New Zealander. And as the question says, there are many different New Zealanders. But this particular study, I mean, it was very much, looking at it from very much subjectively from her perspective. That's the idea with this intra-individual model. It's how she sees herself. And so, yeah, so certainly, as the question asked, there are different types of New Zealanders, and she's one type, I suppose. And it's changing. It's always changing. I mean, it's not static, right? She's been here 15 years from when she arrived, when I first met her, when she got here to now. It was quite, it was interesting to see how she had changed over that period, just on a personal level.
The same type of New Zealander as you, really?
Yeah, very much so. Yeah.
We have another question from Nisha, who says, work was an important part of Mia's social inclusion. Was she involved in any other social groups, church, South African community groups, hobby groups, and how might that affect the importance of her workplace? Okay,
so that's really interesting, because when she first arrived in New Zealand, she lived in a particular area of Auckland where there are a lot of South Africans living. And so she said directly in one of the interview after 15 years that she had a lot of support from the community, meaning that there were people around her in the neighborhood, basically, that she could always go and visit, that she could phone. And so there was community support close by that she could draw on, all the time. But over time, her work, for example, was, as the question said, as the person who asked the question said, very important to her. And she's always been employed. She's always been the main, that's been her main thing. So her work, spent a lot of time at work. That became her main support afterwards, and less support on the community after this. Over the years, work became more her life rather than community. But she still has connections in the community. She sometimes takes part in South African events that may take place, but not as much as from when she first got here. So she's, and her life has changed too. Her some stuff I can't share for ethical reasons, but things have changed in her personal life. That's also meant that, her life trajectory is not the way she anticipated when she first arrived. So there have been some personal things that have happened that meant she's had to seek support in other places as well.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question, and this is from Pia, and she says, Mia's story, I think, represents a successful case of immigrant identity integration. It seems that her high standard English is central to this positive outcome. I'm interested to find out, Gary, if you encountered a different case, maybe an immigrant who is not as proficient in the main language of the host community.
Well, I'd have to think back to the earlier study, because in Mia's case was different, because she was very, very proficient in English, and her children were young when they got here, and the early study again was with the Afrikaans community, and at that stage of 2001, 2002, for immigrants to come to New Zealand, they needed a certain level of English proficiency. You know, I think it's the same in Australia, right? So you need to demonstrate a particular level of English proficiency, and many of the South Africans who do come over are at that stage would come over with residency already. So they would usually have employment, often professional employment, and so on. And so usually the transition into New Zealand life, certainly for my participants in that early study, were pretty successful. And what I mean by successful is they were able to settle down. Most were able to get jobs. But it's not the same for everyone, of course. You know, everyone's stories are very, very different. And one's idea of success is different from someone else's idea of success. So in a sense, it's quite a hard question to answer. Some people may have felt that they weren't as, that anticipation may not have turned out as well as they expected. So it's a bit hard to say. But I think on the whole, people did well in terms of settling down.
Okay, thank you very much. And I think Linda also made a valuable comment that notion of hybridity seems a bit relevant as well. And thanks for that comment.
Oh, yeah, I see it there. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and if you have any further questions, you probably email Gary. And thank you very much for the great talk, Gary. We really appreciate it. And from now on, we are going to have